oil is the political process. There's not influence. It is the political process. I mean, we saw, for example, during the Bush administration that the oil industry was our government. There was no difference. Now it's more subtle, but the influence of energy is powerful and still there. It's just more complex how it operates. If you look at for example, the Republican Party right now, you have every presidential candidate, endorsing the XL pipeline, more than endorsing, falling in love. I mean, Ted Cruz actually said, you have to love the XL pipeline. He sends Valentines to a pipe, right? I mean, this is how extreme it's gone. So that they're kissing the pipeline, they're loving the pipeline. Like, why? And the answer is a four-letter word, KOCH, the Kochs. Now, follow how this operates and how this affects our foreign policy. Okay, the Kochs big refinery. They bought a big refinery on the Gulf Coast of Texas, and they were losing a fortune because even though it's in Texas, it can't use Texas oil. And so what they had to use was heavy oil. They could only get it from Venezuela. They charge a premium. Used to be a discount. So they had to get rid of Chavez and Maduro and that progressive government in Venezuela. They could either do it by assassination, as Pat Robertson suggested. That didn't work. Or they can manipulate the country's political system. That may work or may not work. But all else fails, get the oil from somewhere else, Canada, at a super steep discount. That gives you the XL pipeline. And that's the whole reason for the XL pipeline. The Kochs don't own the pipeline, but they're the ones who get the oil. Each Koch brother will make about $1 billion extra a year if the XL pipeline goes through. Now, you say, well, what about the Democratic side? There's an opposition. Well, yes and no. The Democrats have their own alliances, like with BP and the current administration. So, for example, President Obama, Mr. Let's not cook the planet. Global warming is a terrible threat to everyone. And yet, he approved drilling in the Arctic. I was up in the Arctic Circle, actually, where they're going to drill at Kaktovik. And I was called up by the Inuit speakers, Etok, the great whale hunter, and he said, look, we're done. We're finished as a people if they drill here. I mean, and also if you have a spill in the Arctic Ocean, it goes under the ice cap to Norway. There couldn't be a dumber, stupider, more dangerous, poisonous idea than drilling in the Arctic, and yet you have a Democratic president that approved it. So that only happens because you had a tremendous influence by BP and Shell in the current administration. The Kochs have tremendous influence mostly on the Republican side, but they are not Republicans. Koch Oil is not a Republican operation. They are for Kochs, and they don't bet on the horses. They own the whole damn racetrack.
Of course, the majority of scientists in the world have agreed to the consensus of human-caused climate change or human-exacerbated climate change. Americans seem uniquely ignorant in this analysis. I wanted you to kind of analyze how the media disinformation campaign works on behalf of the oil industry.
One of the ways it does it is it buys up a lot of academics. Almost every biologist in America is on the payroll of British Petroleum through a $500 million grant to the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, which controls almost all the science of oil spills. Now what's happening with climate science is, again, it's not just air pollution, it's money pollution of science. So they'll take a dissenting scientist and they will blow up their stature.
Earlier when you said National Petroleum Radio, of course you're talking about NPR, and this is the most amazing report ever, right? In the wake of the BP oil spill, they have on this scientist who's talking about, don't worry, the oil is just gonna be eaten by oil-eating bacteria.
Yes.
And talk about that specific report and what's behind it.
$500 million dumped into the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and those scientists under Livermore's control took over the airways. Obviously, BP worked very hard to get their guys out there, and never on NPR which was leading this charge that Mother Earth cleans itself, never once did I hear that these guys were paid for by British Petroleum. That's important. Ivor van Heerden, who was head of the Hurricane Center at the Louisiana State University. After Katrina, he said the reason why this city was underwater was because the oil industry had destroyed the mangroves. All the drilling and dragging of drilling rigs, etc., had basically destroyed 100 miles of swamp protection. People say, why do people live in New Orleans underwater? Well, the Gulf Coast was brought to the edge of New Orleans by the oil industry. Van Heerden had raised the alarm 1 month before Katrina drowned New Orleans. He said this city could be underwater in 30 days. 30 days later, it was underwater. He said that on British television. He was right. Instead of building him a statue and say, thank you for telling us, trying to save this city, they shut down the Hurricane Center. Can you imagine Louisiana shutting down its Hurricane Center? And they replaced it with a wetlands center. What was going on here? They got a check from Chevron Oil. Chevron said, we will pay for and fund a giant center, academic center, if we get to pick the professors and you close down Van Heerden and his Hurricane Center. So Louisiana State University lost its Hurricane Center, if you can imagine, for this oil company basically propaganda forum where the oil companies literally pick the professors. Remember, we don't have an investigative media in America. Our reporters don't go after facts. They're not reporters, they're repeaters. Instead, what they do is they say, well, on one hand this, on one hand that. Well, some scientists believe that the Earth is getting hot and we're doing this to Mother Earth. And then there's some guys who say no. And they don't bother to tell you that those guys who say no are on the payroll of the oil companies.
But we don't have time for the super elites at the helm to suddenly care about the environment. Drastic, immediate action is needed to even begin to turn around the situation.
The United Nations last year came up with its most definitive statements on what was needed to basically avert the worst consequences of climate change. And the action that was made very clear was that 3/4 of known existing fossil fuels need to stay in the ground. That's it. That's the only way, not to avert harm caused by climate change, not to avert the problems that we're already experiencing, but to avert the worst predicted consequences of climate change. So that means that where we need to start from now is that the resource needs to stay in the ground.
But the empire is doing the opposite of that, chasing profits at any cost. 20,000 oil spills are reported each year in the United States alone, not to mention millions of gallons spilled across the world in once pristine habitats like the Amazon rainforest. In the Niger Delta, they have had the shocking equivalent of an Exxon Valdez spill every single year for the past 50 years, courtesy of untouchable overlords like ExxonMobil and Shell. More oil spilled from train crashes in 2013 than in the previous 4 decades combined, or more than 1 million gallons of crude oil spilled from derailed train cars across the country. In 2014, the number hit another record high. Yet rail remains the #1 preferred mode of transportation for oil companies. Hundreds of thousands of miles worth of pipelines traverse the length of the U.S., a stretch of ticking time bombs of potential disaster run by unregulated, cost-cutting owners. Between 2008 and 2012, over 500 oil industry workers lost their lives in on-the-job accidents, a rate 8 times the average of other industries. So much detriment for a resource that's not even necessary. If this system put the needs of people and the environment first, there would be little dependency on such a damaging fuel source. Stanford engineers have already developed a cost-effective, state-by-state plan to transition the entire U.S. to all renewable energy sources by 2050. The cost of the Iraq war alone could have covered all global investments in renewable energy needed to halt climate change trends. We see that big oil can buy the politicians who regulate it, have the military pledge allegiance to its interests, be shielded from pollution restrictions, leech off U.S. tax dollars, control mass media, crush alternative energy, and avert punishment for all of the crimes it commits. It is utterly insane that small boardrooms of self-serving billionaires are empowered to act as though the only future that exists is in their stock portfolios. They've been destroying lives and habitats for over a century, and now their unfettered greed is a threat to human civilization itself. Their path towards a tar-covered, uninhabitable dystopia won't be reversed unless the power structure is flipped. We can't fight the rule of oil tycoons without fighting the system of corporate empire that dutifully serves them.